It's the last week before our first balance update since the release of Call of the Mountain, which, if we're going off of the patch notes that they put out on the release of Call of the Mountain, it's likely to be something like Ezreal getting an increase in the level up requirement, a change to the allegiance of Yordle Grifter, and a pretty much complete rework of Lee Sin based on the wording that they used. But we're going to focus on what is going on in the current tournament meta. This will probably be mostly relevant next weekend, which is unfortunate because next weekend will be the open qualifier for that Ascent of Targon Invitational. I know some of you forgot about it. It only got pushed back a couple of weeks, and we will be seeing that once crossplay is live on patch 1.10, which will be coming out this Wednesday. But in the meantime, we have tournaments going on this weekend, including TeamIQ's first qualifier for their Invitational that'll be taking place later this year, I believe October. But the finalist of this tournament is going to be invited to that Invitational. So we want to get you into the top cut of that, give you your best shot at getting that Invitational money, and it is going to be in a unified, that is card-locked format. So I'm going to go over some of the newer decks that we've seen in the meta here as we round out patch 1.8, as well as give you a few tips on some things that you might see, what a standard lineup is going to look like, and of course, break down how unified is going to affect these lineups. So as usual, we've got a couple of updates to the tier list, the main ones being the Lux Aesol deck that has really made a big splash into the meta this week, the Pirate Aggro deck that is once again so popular that it's popping up in non-aggro lineups, which is something that you really only see out of an aggro deck if it's a very good one. I think Scouts is usually the only one that branches out into that, and maybe Indoor if you do consider that an aggro deck, because Indoor does play a little more mid-range, Scouts does play a little more mid-range sometimes. Pirate Aggro doesn't really do that. It's pretty smork, so to see it pop up in other lineups does speak to the strength of the deck. Even though I haven't personally been super impressed by its results lately, I do think it's going to belong in tier 1 and could be pretty popular going into the weekend. Added Twisted Fate Ezreal back in there after I kind of figured out its place in the meta. Karma Ezreal, it hasn't really been played a lot, but I think it's just kind of getting slept on and does still belong in tier 1. Down in tier 2, we brought down Ramsol, Nab, Deep, Discard Aggro, Frostbite midrange, all a little more appropriately placed. And then tier 3 feels like it's kind of the relegated area of like decks that were doing kind of cool things in week 1 have started to really fall off. We're not going to see a lot more anymore. Nightfall Aggro has really fallen to the wayside given the high presence of Endure Spiders, and that's going to be even more so the case going into a unified tournament where you do get to commit that Shadow Isle to multiple regions, or the Freljord to multiple regions rather, because you do get to play Endure Spiders and another Freljord deck, since Endure is the only Freljord card being played in the current lists of Endure Spiders, which I'll get into in a second here. Because first I wanted to show you this Lux Aesol deck. This has been extremely popular this week leading up into this weekend. It's being played by 5 of the 8 Fight Night players by Giant Slayer TV, as well as taking over the King of Runeterra tournament hosted by Riot Korea and Invent Global. Every single player that we have seen has had this in their lineup in that tournament, and a couple of them are even making some weird adaptations to the champion lineup. We've seen multiple combinations of Lux, Aurelion and Leona. We've seen 1 Leona, 2 Aesol. We've seen a 2-2-2 split. I think that in the West, Lux Aesol as 3-ofs is going to be the standard going into this weekend, and this is kind of what the deck looks like. There's a lot of healing available to it with the Radiant Guardian and the Star Shaping. The full suite of combat tricks, the concerted strikes, and the single combats to really take advantage of that Radiant Guardian healing. And you do get to fight for board pretty early. If you wanted to, you could even throw back in Solari Soldiers to make sure that you have that turn 1 presence, as Spacey Sketcher doesn't really get something like that done. Pale Cascade is something that we've seen in these lists before. BBG just didn't happen to be running it. And overall, I think this is an extremely solid deck and maybe one of the best decks in the format. It'll be interesting to see how this one comes up this weekend, but I overwhelmingly think this will be the most popular Demacia and Targon lineup, and I will show you what a standard lineup looks like a little bit later on. Then we have Pirate Aggro, not a new archetype, but one that's being revisited by a lot of players. I think this started back in like patch 1.4 while Darrowing was sort of the aggro deck of the format. Players were bringing this out if they didn't feel like committing their Shadow Isle to a deck like that. And overall, it's a really strong deck. It's probably one of the better smorkers in the format. I've seen some players replacing the Misfortune with Twisted Fate in order to hang on to cards a little bit better. The spell lineup is pretty shallow. Make It Rain, Noxian Fervor, Decimate should speak to the kind of deck that you're playing. And overall, you do kind kind of get the board presence of a nab deck. Petty Officer really shines in a deck like this, being able to give you the difference between barrel generation to power up one of your spells, or something like that random 1-drop. There are a lot of good ones out there. Even if you hit an additional copy of Legion Saboteur or Precious Pet, you're going to be feeling that pretty immediately. Demolitionist is seen for the first time in a long time as Crimson Disciple, still not making her way back into the deck. Neither are copies of Transfusion, RIP, Crimson Disciple. But Legion Grenadier makes a return. He's really only seen play in Swain Sejuani decks recently, which really not the place that I expected this card to fall into after the nerf, but, you know, with only dealing 1 damage to face, it does feel a little bit more like a trick than an actual burn effect, but that can be used on off turns to help level up the Gangplank. We don't see anything like a Powder Monkey. You're not super burn focused. Jack the Winner, not necessarily the most standard card in the deck from what I've seen. I haven't really seen this in every list, but I think it's going to be pretty popular. And of course, Captain Farron coming down as that top end, just a great card in general. You're not really going to be able to kill your opponent before turn 5. You know, you are going a little bit more for that. Let me scale into the mid game with things like Gangplank and Jack, get those last few points of damage in to finish off my opponent. But overall, players have been finding the deck extremely consistent and powerful. If you are going to bring a 3 aggro lineup, I do think you want to be banning the Lux Aesol deck, just because it is so overloaded on healing, and these Solaris really help them fight for the board presence in the early game. I know last week I had placed Endure Spiders on the tier list and said everybody knows what Endure Spiders looks like, and then didn't have a tournament topping list from it. This list was posted by Swim. I don't believe Swim was the creator of this version, but he's the one that posted it on decks of Runeterra, so if any Swim fans are out there, you've probably seen this before, but this is definitely the most predominant Endure Spider list that we've been seeing in tournaments. Just about everybody that does bring the deck is running this exact list. It's pretty easily identifiable by the Mono Callista champion lineup, the Soul They Who Endures the Freljord card in the deck, and then the 2 Wraithcaller kind of let you know that they're running this sort of standardized list. I do really like the spell lineup. I constantly speak to Winding God's performance back in patch 1.2, or maybe it was even 1.0, where Endure Spiders was very popular, and he sort of pioneered this cutting down on a lot of the fluff in the deck and going down to Glimpse Beyond, Vengeance, and Atrocity as the only spells in the deck. I do really like running this very low cost, very low to the ground, only advantage spells and Atrocity style of Endure Spiders. So I just wanted to let you know what the Endure Spider decks are actually looking like these days so that you could plan accordingly. But Boulevard, what do you mean by plan accordingly? Just kind of recognize what isn't in the deck. We're not seeing things like Ancient Crocolith. You don't really have to worry about big Callista activators like that. You don't have to worry about Neverglade Collector is kind of the big one. So the healing not really coming out of the deck. The damage that you do is going to stick. And that's sort of the bigger takeaway. If you are playing an aggro deck, you do have a bit of a better chance against this than I think some of the older versions. And that about does it for new decks on the tier list, but I did want to highlight a couple of other decks that we're seeing pop up in Fight Night that I've also seen pop up on Ladder, on Twitter. Players are talking about these. That is War Mother's Call and the Trundle Ladros deck. I think I got this. Nope, this is the Trundle Ladros deck. All right, I got this the right way. So this is kind of a control deck. It's very reminiscent of Karina control, actually, where you're just kind of playing spells, trying to scale into the late game, get that Ladros down. You do have the healing spells of the Shadow Isle and the Freljord combined in order to help you scale into the late game. And your game-ending combo, so to speak, is a Revitalizing Roar onto a Commander Ladros, and you can play Atrocity in the same turn as that on turn 10, because it is 13 mana to get all of that down. But at the end of the day, it's a Ladros control deck with some ramp in it, and then on the side of War Mother's Call, we're still sort of seeing the same thing. You know, you want to ramp, you want to get down this War Mother's, turn into Ladros and Hearthguard, still seeing Trundle and Tryndamere come out. I want to talk about Trundle for a second here, because I feel like a lot of players I'm seeing are saying that, like, oh, Trundle's really underrated, Trundle's one of the best champions in the game, and they're not understanding that Trundle is very similar to Vi, and you never really saw a Vi deck. Vi was never really the centerpiece. She was more of a complement to something. And that's a problem that players seem to be struggling with Trundle, is that you can't really make Trundle the centerpiece of your deck. He's more of a supporting character, filling that same spot as Vi. He is a very good champion for this kind of deck, the War Mother's Call specifically, as well as the control deck. I mean, we saw Karina run Vi. It makes sense that if we are going to take a Karina-esque control deck, flip it from Piltovers onto Freljord, then Trundle is going to find his way into a deck like that. But you really can't make him the focal point. You can't have him as your sole win condition, and we are seeing some higher end cards come out like Commander Ladros, and that's just something that I want players to be aware of going into this weekend. When I say that there are 5 viable Freljord Shadow Isle decks, I am including these in it. So, you know, just kind of be aware that these exist. I don't think they're going to be super popular, but it's hard to say because they are very popular in Fight Night, but it seems to have come out of nowhere, at least from the tournaments that I've been following. But these are the top players. This could be what they're bringing this weekend. Just kind of wanted to make you aware of that. I haven't placed them on the tier list yet because I do need to see some performances out of them. Baseline, I would probably put them both in tier 2. It just kind of is where it is. So now I want to talk about a standard lineup going into a weekend like this, and I'll get into how Unified is going to play into this for a second. But to start off, I want to say that for a region-locked tournament, you could actually build, in my opinion, a tier 1 deck and not overlap any regions. So if you were to pick any 3 of these 4 decks, Endure Spiders, Karma Ezreal, Lux Aesol, or Swain Twisted Fate, you've got yourself a really solid lineup. And then you can kind of mix and match this how you please, depending on which deck ends up getting left out. You could even swap out the Twisted Fate Swain for something like the Pirate aggro, if that's something you're interested in doing. You know, like if you drop Swain and Twisted Fate and you drop Karma Ezreal, you really like Endure LuxSol, you could slot Twisted Fate Ezreal back in there, or you could slot Frostbite Midrange back in there if you want to play Karma Ezreal and LuxSol. You know, you can mix and match this one as you please. I just kind of did want to make you aware of this is overwhelmingly what I expect to be a standard lineup, is just picking 3 of these 4 decks. It is a little bit skewed, not only because you can mix and match how you please. I think that Twisted Fate Ezreal and Frostbite Midrange are 2 of the more popular decks that are going to get splashed into a lineup like this, but I also think that Karma Ezreal probably isn't going to be the most represented deck. It's kind of weird because I feel like this deck is really good. I feel like it's slept on a little bit, especially in North America, but Ezreal was also one of the most popular champions at last week's Rune Cup Brazil. It was the 3rd most played champion in the tournament, only behind Twisted Fate and Swain. So I think that's going to be a little bit different this weekend. I think we're going to see a lot more Aesol because there really wasn't a whole lot last week. I believe it was 22 Aesol players out of 100 players, which is a lot lower than I kind of expected. And then this time around, we're going to see a lot more of that, a lot more Lux, a lot more Swain, a lot more Gangplank. So we'll kind of have to see how that one goes. A lot more Misfortune too. And of course, Lulu is now legal for this tournament, which does shake things up a little bit. If you are going for something like a 3 aggro lineup, I'll get into a second here. I'll show you how Lulu plays into that one. And then if you did want to come in with a full aggro lineup, I think there are 6 really solid decks to choose from. Well, 5 really solid decks and Nightfall aggro. We have Endure, Lulu, Discard, Nightfall, Pirate Burn, and Scouts. You know, you can kind of see there's a little bit of overlap between these. This is a unified tournament. Something that is worth noting is that there's actually no Noxus overlap between Discard, Aggro, and Pirate Burn. That is something that, you know, you can kind of get away with. You probably only get to bring one Demacia deck. You probably only get to bring one Shadow Isle deck, but the options are available to you. I think that Endure probably should make its way into your lineup, but if you really wanted to, you could run something like Lulu, Pirate, and Discard. I think the standard is going to be Endure, Lulu, and Pirate as far as standard aggro lineups go, just because people have been waiting so long to get their hands on this Lulu deck. There is a little bit of overlap between Scouts and Pirate Burn because they both want to play Misfortune. You could adapt that a little bit and play a Twisted Fate in the Pirate deck. I have said that I've seen that in the past. Not sure how great it is, but it is something that I have seen. I'm not really an aggro player, so this is a little bit out of my depth. I've tried playing aggro a lot more lately to try and get a better insight into this, but because it is ladder and not tournament, it's pretty hard to say, honestly. But I do think that, yeah, overwhelmingly, this should be sort of the standard aggro lineup. I nailed the aggro lineup last week. Zinc Elemental actually took 2nd place with Scouts, Discard, Aggro, and Endure Spiders, which I believe is what I had said would be a standard aggro lineup. I think I had included Nightfall in there, but said that Endure is probably a little bit better. So I was right last week. We'll see if I'm right this week. That's Endure, Lulu, Pirate Burn as far as aggro lineups. And then I'm expecting Ramp Soul, Endure, and Twisted Fate Swain for normal lineups. So really, it is just kind of, you know, if people want to play Pirate Burn in their normal lineup, it really could just be Endure, Pirate Burn, and, you know, the Ramp Soul. There's a pretty good amount of flexibility. There's also, you know, everybody who doesn't want to run Endure or wants to run some other kind of Freljord deck, they get to throw a wrench in your works a little bit. There's too many lineups. We're still in too healthy or diverse of a meta for me to give you the total breakdown and let you know this is what you'll see in this percentage. But I feel like I've got a pretty good read on things going into this. It's just a matter of, you know, Endure might be overestimated by me. I might be expecting a lot more of that than I usually am, but it is a unified event still, and we do overwhelmingly see Endure in events like that, although you could see Freljord decks alongside of it. There just aren't really any Freljord aggro decks outside of Endure, but in something like a normal lineup, we could see a couple of Sejuani decks. Frostbite Midrange still comes to mind. Black Boss did just pick up a win with that last weekend, but overall, we'll have to see. I think that Endure is going to be in just about every lineup. Pretty painless, right? Don't you feel a little bit better going into this weekend? Even just a little bit? Just remember to be aware of the fact that Endure could not be as popular as I'm expecting it to be, or rather that you will run into players who are not playing Endure in their lineup, even if it is something like 70% of the tournament that brought it. Now, I do want to give myself a little bit of a shout out and let you know what's going to be going on with the channel over the course of the weekend. I am currently casting the 2nd installation of the King of Runeterra tournament with Shit Just Works. The finals and top 4, I believe, are playing out tomorrow, so we'll be streaming that on Shit's Twitch channel, bring it over to my YouTube channel as the all of the Riot Korea tournaments are kind of centralized here. I didn't want to break that up. So you will be seeing those pop up over the course of the weekend and a little bit into next week if you want to check out what the Riot sponsored tournaments are looking like. If nothing else, I would recommend watching the first minute. The graphics team over at Inven and Riot Korea is absolutely phenomenal. But that's where I'm getting a lot of information from going into this weekend as well. It just happened to line up with Fight Night, and that's where I'm really getting this high presence of the Lux Aesol decks. But until next time, my name is Boulevard. Thank you so much for watching, and I will have the link to the signups for the IQ Invitational, or the IQ Qualifier for their Invitational down in the description below. And as always, good luck in your tournaments.